I stood perfectly still on the peeling gray porch, checking my watch. Through the screen door, my father was screaming, his face twisted in rage. He called me a traitor. A thief. He shouted that I was dead to him. I kept my silence. He thought this was a negotiation. He didn't know that inside my bag I held the deed to the ground he was standing on. And he didn't know the sheriff was exactly 2 minutes away. I just watched the second-hand tick. Calm. Factual. Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever had to be the bad guy just to protect yourself from family? I'm reading every story tonight. To understand why I didn't scream, you have to see the ledger. You have to go back 12 years to the day the debt was first incurred. I was 22, sitting at the same mahogany table where they would later demand my solvency. My grandmother had left me exactly $150,000. It was my exit strategy, my freedom. But my parents didn't see it that way. To them, my money was a family resource and my brother Ryan was a family emergency. They sat me down and explained it with the calm rationality of bank robbers asking for the vault code. Ryan had a vision, they said. A luxury house flipping business. He just needed capital. A runway. They didn't ask. They informed me that my inheritance would be the seed money. They called it a loan. They promised high returns. I was young and I was trained to be obedient. I signed the check. That signature cost me a decade. While Ryan leased a Range Rover and played CEO in empty construction sites, I lived on instant noodles and panic. I worked 2 jobs while studying for my CPA exams. I developed ulcers before I turned 25. I remember one specific night shivering in an apartment with no heat because I couldn't afford the gas bill, scrolling through social media to see Ryan popping champagne on a boat. My parents liked his photos. They ignored my calls. For years I thought it was just favoritism. I thought if I worked harder, if I became successful enough, they would finally respect me. But forensic accounting taught me to look for the story behind the numbers. It taught me to analyze the flow of emotional currency. And that's when I realized the truth. It wasn't just that they loved him more. It was a structural necessity. Every toxic system needs a pressure valve. In our family, Ryan was the golden child, the vessel designated to hold all their grandiose delusions. He was the proof that they were special, destined for greatness. But for that delusion to survive reality, someone else had to hold the shame. Someone had to be the container for their anxiety, their failures, and their debts. That was me. I was the scapegoat. I wasn't just the backup plan. I was the designated loser. They didn't neglect me because I was invisible. They suppressed me because my competence threatened their narrative. If I could succeed without their help, then Ryan's failure was his own fault, and that was a truth they could not afford to face. So I stopped trying to earn their love. I started keeping score. I tracked every dollar, every insult, every missed birthday. I built a ledger of loss in my head, calculating the compound interest on 12 years of betrayal. By the time I stood on that porch, the balance was due. And I was done accepting IOUs. The inciting incident didn't happen on that porch. It happened 30 days earlier on a Tuesday afternoon that felt heavy with the humid weight of a Savannah summer. My mother called me at work. She didn't say hello. She just said, "We're losing the estate, Morgan. You need to come home." There was no panic in her voice, only the sharp, expectant tone of a manager calling an employee into the office. I drove to the house, my stomach tightening with that old familiar reflex of obedience. The Victorian estate loomed behind the weeping willows, peeling paint hanging like dead skin. Inside, the air smelled of stale sherry and old dust, the scent of a dynasty that had been rotting from the inside for years. I walked into the dining room and stopped. The table was set with the good silver. My brother Ryan was lounging in my father's chair, looking disheveled but arrogant, swirling a glass of scotch. It was an ambush. My father Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. He slid a piece of paper across the mahogany. It was a foreclosure notice. He told me there was a temporary lien on the property. A misunderstanding, he called it. A cash flow issue. He told me they needed $250,000 to make it go away. He didn't ask if I had it. He didn't ask if I was willing. He simply instructed me to take out a loan against my own portfolio. He spoke as if my financial stability was a family asset he had simply left in storage for a rainy day. I looked at Ryan. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at the paper. The numbers didn't add up. Forensic accounting is about patterns, and this pattern screamed negligence. "I need to see the books," I said. "I'm not giving you $250,000 without an audit." The room went cold. My mother stood up, her face tight with a lifetime of repressed entitlement. She looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. She told me I had always been difficult. She told me I didn't understand how the world worked for people like Ryan, people with vision. And then she said the words that severed the last thread of my loyalty. She looked right at me and said, "You've always been lucky, Morgan. You have it easy, but we're family. You owe us, especially since you brought that burden of a child into this world without a husband." The silence that followed was absolute. She had called my son, my 10-year-old Noah, a burden. She had dismissed 15 years of 80-hour work weeks as luck. In that second, the daughter in me died. The woman who wanted their approval evaporated. All that was left was the auditor. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table. I just looked at them, really looked at them, and realized I wasn't sitting with my parents. I was sitting with parasites. And you don't negotiate with parasites. You exterminate them. I didn't storm out. I didn't throw my wine in Ryan's face or scream at my mother for her cruelty. That would have been an emotional reaction, and emotions are liabilities. I simply stood up, picked up my purse, and walked out the front door. Behind me, I heard my father shouting my name, a command he still believed held weight. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away from the decaying estate until the smell of mildew was replaced by the clean, sterile air of my own car. The moment I was out of their sight, I made a call, not to a therapist but to Haley. She's an attorney, a shark in a silk blouse who handles distressed assets. "I need you to run a title search," I said, "and I need a credit check on a property, rush order." For the next 48 hours, I treated my family like a hostile corporate takeover. Sleep became irrelevant. Grief was just noise. I filtered out. I audited. I pulled public records, lien histories, and court filings. I built a timeline of their insolvency. What I found wasn't just bad luck. It was gross negligence bordering on fraud. They had lied about the numbers. Of course they had. The debt wasn't $250,000. It was $450,000. The temporary lien was actually a second mortgage taken out 3 years ago, followed by a home equity line of credit that had been maxed out in 6 months. I traced the withdrawals. They didn't go to home repairs or medical bills. They went to casinos in Atlantic City and online sports betting platforms. Ryan wasn't just a failure. He was an addict, and my parents were his enablers, feeding the house into the slot machine of his life. I sat in my home office staring at the spreadsheet. The math was indisputable. If I gave them the money they asked for, it would be gone in a year. They were a black hole. Financial gravity would crush anything I threw at them. There was no saving the estate for them. It was already dead. They just hadn't signed the death certificate. So I made a different calculation. I looked at my own portfolio. The stocks, the bonds, the savings I had scraped together over a decade of missed holidays and lonely nights. It was enough. Just enough. I called the bank holding the distressed note. They were desperate to offload a toxic asset before the foreclosure auctions began. "I want to buy the note," I told the loan officer. "You want to pay off the mortgage?" he asked, assuming I was the dutiful daughter coming to the rescue. "No," I said, my voice flat. "I want to buy the note. I want to hold the debt. I want to be the lien holder." I liquidated everything. I sold the tech stocks. I cashed out the bonds. It was a terrifying financial risk, but it was the only way to stop the bleeding. I wasn't going to be their savior. I was executing a hostile acquisition. I wired the funds. The transfer confirmation appeared on my screen, a green check mark that cost me my entire liquid net worth. But it bought me something priceless. It bought me the gavel. The wire transfer was queued. $450,000 sat in the outbox of my life, waiting for a single click to transfer ownership of my parents' mistakes to my name. But before I pressed send, I did what any good auditor does. I ran a final compliance check. I opened the full lien history file sent by the bank, a dense 300-page PDF detailing every financial scar on the property. I scrolled past the second mortgage. I scrolled past the home equity line. And then I stopped. Page 112, a document dated 5 years ago. It was a high-risk commercial bridge loan for a business entity called R.H. Ventures, Ryan's shell company. The loan was secured by the estate, but because the property was already over-leveraged, the lender had required a co-signer with a prime credit rating. I saw my name printed on the guarantor line, Morgan. My blood ran cold, the temperature in my home office dropping 20 degrees in a second. I zoomed in. There, next to my printed name, was a signature. It looped the way mine loops. It crossed the same with the same sharp angle I use. It was a good forgery, but it had a tremor at the end of the 9 that I don't have. It was Ryan's hand trying to be mine. I felt a wave of nausea followed immediately by a wave of ice. They hadn't just wasted my inheritance. They hadn't just asked me for a bailout. My brother had committed identity fraud. He had used my credit, my name, my financial identity to secure a loan for his gambling habits. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was below the signature line. Every legal document requires witnesses. I looked at the witness signatures. 2 of them. One was distinct, elegant, cursive. The other was a heavy, blocky scrawl. Susan and Richard. My parents. They had been there. They hadn't just looked the other way. They had handed him the pen. They had watched their golden child commit a felony against their scapegoat, and they had signed their names to validate it. They valued his temporary comfort more than my legal safety. If he had defaulted on this specific loan 5 years ago, the bank wouldn't have just taken their house. They would have come for my assets. They would have garnished my wages. They would have destroyed the career I built from scratch. They had risked my entire existence to buy him a few more months of delusion. I stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. Any lingering doubt, any tiny microscopic fragment of guilt about what I was about to do disintegrated. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a crime scene, and I wasn't the daughter coming to save the day. I was the prosecutor. I didn't call the police. Not yet. That would be too messy, too slow. I needed total control. If I let this go to court now, the asset might get frozen. I needed to own the evidence. I needed to hold the deed, the debt, and the proof of their crime in my hand. I looked at the wire transfer screen. The submit button pulsed. I wasn't just buying a distressed asset. I was buying a weapon. I clicked the button. Transaction complete. I owned them. I drove back to the estate in silence. The sun was setting over the weeping willows, casting long, bruised shadows across the porch where my father had screamed at me just days before. I parked my car, but I didn't turn off the engine immediately. I watched the house. The lights were on in the dining room. I could see shadows moving. They were celebrating. They thought my silence over the last 48 hours meant I was arranging the wire transfer. They thought they had won. I picked up the manila folder from the passenger seat. It contained the deed, the transfer of the note, and a copy of the forged loan agreement. It was heavy, not in weight but in gravity. Bypassing the doorbell, I pushed open the front door. Laughter drifted from the dining room. Crystal clinking against crystal. I walked in. They were all there. Richard, Susan, Ryan. Ryan was holding a bottle of champagne, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who has never paid for his own mistakes. When they saw me, the laughter stopped, replaced by a greedy anticipation. Well, Ryan grinned, extending a hand. Did the wire go through? Can we pop this? I didn't answer. I walked to the head of the table, the spot my father usually occupied, and placed the folder on the polished wood. The sound it made was soft, final. I didn't get you the loan, I said. My voice was steady, devoid of any inflection. My mother's face fell. Morgan, don't tell me you failed. We need that money by Friday. I didn't fail, I corrected her. I liquidated my portfolio. I contacted the distressed asset division of your lender, and I bought the note. They stared at me blinking, trying to parse the vocabulary of finance that they had ignored for decades. What does that mean? My father asked, his voice low. It means I own the debt, I said. And because the debt is secured by this property and you are in default, I own the title. I am not your daughter right now. I am the bank, and I am your landlord. The explosion was immediate. My father slammed his fist on the table. My mother started screaming about blood and betrayal. Ryan called me a snake. They were loud, chaotic, and terrifyingly familiar. But as I stood there watching them unravel, something shifted in my perception. For 34 years, I had been terrified of these people. I had seen them as giants, authorities, the gatekeepers of my worth. But as I watched my father's face turn purple and my mother clutch her pearls in performative agony, I realized something profound. Their power was an illusion. It was a costume they rented with money they didn't have. It is a strange phenomenon, the illusion of power of the empty wallet. In a capitalist society, we often mistake the appearance of wealth for the presence of character. My parents had spent decades acting like aristocrats, demanding respect as if it were a birthright. But without the financial leverage to back it up, their authority evaporated. They weren't powerful patriarchs or matriarchs. They were just angry ghosts in a rented room shouting at the person who paid the electric bill. They had, but they never were. And now that they had nothing, they were nothing. I waited for them to run out of breath. When the screaming subsided into shocked panting, I slid a single sheet of paper forward. "This is a standard residential lease," I said. "The market rent for a property of this size is $4,500 a month, plus arrears. Your first payment is due in 72 hours. If you cannot pay, you must vacate." "You can't do this," Ryan shouted, stepping toward me. "I'll sue you." I looked him dead in the eye. "I wouldn't do that, Ryan, because I saw page 112. I saw the signature. I know about the forgery." He froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. "I could send you to prison for identity fraud," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than their screaming ever could. "And I could have Mom and Dad charged as accomplices. Eviction is my mercy. Take it." I turned to leave. My mother reached out to grab my arm to beg to manipulate, but I stepped out of reach. I picked up my water bottle from the side table, the one I had brought with me because I refused to drink their water or eat their food ever again. I walked out the door, leaving them in the silence of a house they no longer owned. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in denial. They didn't pack. They didn't call movers. Instead, they launched a PR campaign. My mother posted on Facebook a long, weeping diatribe about ungrateful children and the cruelty of the modern world. She didn't mention the forgery. She didn't mention the gambling debts. She just painted a portrait of a saintly matriarch being thrown into the street by a daughter she had loved too much. Ryan sent me texts. First threats, then bargaining, then begging. "I can fix this," he wrote. "Just give me 6 months. I have a deal closing." I didn't reply. I forwarded every message to Haley to add to the file. The deadline arrived on a Friday morning. I met the sheriff at the end of the driveway. He was a kind man with tired eyes who had seen too many family disputes. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked. "Once we execute, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I said. We walked up the driveway together. The house looked even sadder in the daylight, the grandeur stripping away to reveal rot. The sheriff knocked. My father answered, still wearing his pajamas at noon. When he saw the uniform, his face crumpled. The bluster, the rage, the entitlement, it all deflated. He wasn't a patriarch anymore. He was just an old man who had bet on the wrong horse. The eviction itself was pathetic. There was no violence, no dramatic standoff. Ryan tried to take the copper wiring from the walls in the basement, a final petty act of scavenging. The sheriff caught him and escorted him to his car with a warning. My mother sat on the front steps and wept, not for the loss of her home, I realized, but for the loss of her audience. I stood by my car and watched them leave. They drove away in 2 separate cars, their possessions crammed into the back seats. They didn't look at me. They didn't wave. They just disappeared down the long, oak-lined road. I walked into the empty house. It was silent. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner. The humidity of Savannah seemed to lift, replaced by a cool breeze drifting through the open door. I walked through the rooms, the dining room where they had demanded my money, the parlor where they had judged my life, the office where they had forged my name. They were just rooms now. Wood and plaster and dust. The ghosts were gone. I didn't move in. I didn't want to live in the museum of my trauma. I called a contractor that afternoon. "Gut it," I said. "Renovate it. And put it on the market." I wasn't keeping the estate. I was liquidating it. The family legacy was a trap, and I had dismantled it brick by brick. The final act didn't happen in Savannah. It happened 6 months later in the clean, modern kitchen of my own home in Atlanta. Sunlight was pouring in through the skylights, illuminating the quartz countertops and the flour dusting the air. Noah was sitting on a stool covered in dough, laughing as we tried to shape cookies. My mother never baked with me. She was always too busy managing appearances. But here with Noah there was no performance, just flour and sugar and mess. The sale of the estate had closed a week ago. After paying off the liens, the taxes, and the agent fees, there was a surplus. Not a fortune, but enough. I didn't keep it. I didn't want a single cent of that cursed money touching my accounts. Instead, I opened a trust fund in Noah's name. It is locked tight, untouchable, until he is 25. As I watched him concentrate on the cookie cutter, his tongue poking out in focus, I thought about justice. People often mistake justice for punishment. They think it's about watching the bad guys suffer. And yes, there was a grim satisfaction in knowing my parents were living in a 2-bedroom apartment stripped of their pretenses. but that wasn't the real victory. Real justice is like gardening. Sometimes you look at a tree, a family tree, and you realize the rot has gone too deep. You can't heal it. You can't love it back to health. If you let it stay, it will infect everything around it. It will block the light. It will poison the soil. So you have to make the hard choice. You have to cut it down. You have to uproot it completely, not out of malice but out of necessity. You clear the ground so the new saplings can find the sun. I looked at Noah. He is the sapling. He will grow up without debt. He will grow up without hearing he is a burden. He will grow up knowing that love is not a transaction and family is not a hostage situation. I didn't just evict my parents from a house. I evicted them from his future. And that is a legacy worth fighting for. If you've ever had to prune your own family tree to save your peace share, I broke the cycle in the comments. Let's remind each other that we are the architects of our own families.